My name is Patience Mason, and my husband Bob was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam in 1965 and 66. When he went over, he was kind of a, one of those smart alecky pilot types. And when he came back, when he went over, he was a very slender, 135 pounds, 5 feet 11. When he came back, he weighed 119 pounds. It was the first thing I noticed. He was very, very thin. And the first night he was back, my introduction to post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm going to make a loud noise now. There was a noise like this. And that was him taking off from the bed, straight up in the air, level flight. Made way less noise when he landed. And he did that every day for about the next 7 years, every night. Lots of times, some nights, not so often, other nights. Seemed to get worse with time. I had no idea what had happened to him. No idea what he'd been through. No idea what was going on with him. And he actually thought that he was just crazy or something like that, whereas I thought that I was being a bad wife, or he wouldn't be having these wake-ups and other problems that he developed. So I'm going to start out with a definition of PTSD. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? To some people, sometimes it's a psychiatrist, sometimes it's a vet, sometimes it's a family member, post-traumatic stress disorder is a problem. Not to me. To me, the problem is war. And post-traumatic stress disorder is a solution. All of its symptoms start out as survivor skills. All of its symptoms start out as survivor skills. In the medical model, something is wrong with you if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. To me, something is right with you. It's proof of survival. Dead people do not get PTSD, and that's the bottom line. You lived, you did whatever it took to survive using the God-given or evolution-given capacities that you were born with. But these survival skills, which help you live through the trauma, can, over time, become your biggest problems. And that's the paradox of PTSD. What saved your life can then become the worst thing in your life. But if you don't get anything else from this talk, the most important thing that I will tell you is it is normal to be affected by trauma. Normal, normal, normal. Normal people are affected by what they live through. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder starts out with a traumatic stressor, and I'm going to define the 4 kinds of traumatic stressors. There used to be a sentence in the definition of this that traumatic stressors were, in quotes, outside the range of usual human experience and would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. That's a really important thing, because if a person doesn't have distress from something they've been through, the likelihood is that they have had previous traumas and are numb, not that it wasn't distressing to them. But they've now added a sentence that the traumatic stressor has to evoke fear, horror, or helplessness in the survivor. Of course, if you come from a very tough background, things may not evoke fear, horror, and helplessness in you because you already have PTSD. The traumatic stressors used to be spelled out in the diagnostic criteria. The first one is a serious threat to one's life or physical integrity. Combat, of course, is this. So is rape or battering, being wounded, being mortared or rocketed, being in an airplane that's being shot at, being tortured, being threatened with mutilation, being a prisoner of war. All of those things are traumatic stressors. They're a serious threat to your life or physical integrity. The second kind of traumatic stressor is a serious threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or other close relatives or friends. Now, most people's relatives and friends are not in the war with them, but people who are in war have never been closer than they are to their buddies. And so this traumatic stressor applies to war too. When your buddies are being threatened, the people that you really care about, the people who keep your back safe, that is a traumatic stressor to you. Now, in civilian life, this can involve seeing your parents fighting each other, your father battering your mother, or vice versa. Family violence is an important traumatic stressor. Soldiers have guns. Little kids don't have guns. Things are more traumatic when you're little. Another way this works is if you've worked on an airplane and the pilot gets shot down. That is a loss of something you really cared about. You don't have to be there. People who lost children in the Twin Towers can have PTSD from that. People who lost their spouses, their parents, they can have PTSD from that. Off-duty firefighters and cops in New York City, a lot of them have post-traumatic stress disorder because they lost friends in those things. The guy who was trying to warn the government about that the Challenger was going to blow up, they tried to set it off while it was cold. He got PTSD and he finally killed himself. Nobody would listen to him when he was making the phone calls. Post-traumatic stress disorder is worse when it's caused by human neglect or cruelty. The third category of traumatic stressor is sudden destruction of home or community, or sudden loss of home or community. Now, people usually think of this in terms of Hurricane Andrew, or a fire, a flood, an earthquake, something like that. But if you're in combat and you're rocketed or mortared in the place where you were safe is suddenly not safe, that's the same thing. You've just lost your safe home. If you're medevaced, not only have you had the first traumatic stressor, your bodily integrity's been damaged, but they take you out of there instantly and you lose your community. You lose your squad. You lose your friends. If everybody in your squad is killed, the same thing. You have lost not only friends, but your community. It's a second traumatic stressor. There's a Norwegian study of industrial accident survivors, and they did a lot better in the hospital if somebody from their job came and stayed with them all the time. And that, of course, does not happen to veterans. Once they're wounded, they're out of the field. Sometimes they never see anybody that they've served with again. The last traumatic stressor is seeing another person, any person, who has recently been or is being seriously injured or killed as the result of accident or physical violence. This is really, really common in war. You're always seeing wounded or dead or body parts or whatever, and that is a traumatic stressor to anyone. All these details are now covered by the following sentence in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others. What does that mean? I don't know what it means, and I don't think a guy sitting in an office interviewing somebody who has been through hell will be able from this thing to ask the right questions. To me, it's almost a numbing ritual for the diagnostician. We'll just talk in big words that don't mean anything. Now, any one of these traumatic stressors that you have once can cause post-traumatic stress disorder. Most veterans have had hundreds of them, if not thousands of them. There are people who have had hundreds of them in their childhoods. So I always ask veterans, how many did you have? And yet you lived. That is remarkable. Like I said, for shrinks, PTSD is evidence that you have a problem. For me, it's evidence that you have a solution. You lived. It's the bottom line. The symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, these are things that help keep you alive, but they can also become your biggest problems. It comes in 3 sets. The first one is emotional numbing, which is then followed over time by avoidance because you want to maintain the emotional numbing. The second one is hyperarousal. Those are real survivor skills, like moving fast, not being able to sleep, getting angry real easily, and stuff like that. The third set is re-experiencing. And I have a number of ideas about why people re-experience things. I'll talk about them later. I think the first 2 sets start at the moment of the trauma. People get numb. There's a capacity our brain has called attention to threat. When there's a threat on the horizon, you are paying attention to it, and you're not having all those regular everyday thoughts, feelings, and emotions. You're just focused. That is God-given or evolution-given. And the second one, the hyperarousal, are those startle responses that when your brain absolutely floods with adrenaline and you become able to move really fast and do whatever it takes to survive. So emotional numbing and hyperarousal are evolutionary-based survival skills. You are born with them. Every animal has them. Every animal can do attention to threat, and every animal can move quickly and rapidly to save their life. You know, there's the flight or fight syndrome. The fight or flight. That's how it's usually expressed. You have a fight or flight reaction. But there's actually, if you watch animals, there's fight, flight, or freeze. You know, there are animals that just freeze and play dead. And we're all born with these three things. The most common thing in nature is to flee. They send you through basic training so that you will fight. And a lot of the training that women receive is to freeze, to just stay there and take it, whatever's happening. But those two things, the hyperarousal and the numbing, kick in right away. So we're going to just go through the symptoms one by one. Numbing is there so that you can do whatever it takes to survive. Whatever it takes. This is not, you're not going to be doing nice, pretty, clean, happy things like what happens in the movies. Sometimes what it takes to survive is very ugly. But in order to be able to survive yourself and to do your job so that other people will survive, you have to stifle your reactions, shut down your feelings. You don't have time for them. And the first symptom under this is a restricted range of affect, which is basically numbness. Feelings are not important. As a matter of fact, they can get you killed. If you're sitting there crying while somebody's shooting at you, they may get you. In medical personnel, actually, this is called professionalism. You know, they don't sit there and cry when somebody comes into the ER. They work. They do what it takes. So this is a realistic and effective survival skill. It's also very hard to let go of later because the feelings are so painful. We are not talking about, you know, I lost my wallet or something like that. We're talking about I lost my friend in pieces. The second symptom in this set is a feeling of detachment and estrangement from others. Veterans have always said, war changed me. And the fact is, unless you have been through a trauma or a war, you cannot understand what it's like. You can want to understand, you can read all about it, you can watch movies, you can listen to stories. But if you're really honest, you know there is a quantum leap between that and the reality of war. So when people feel detached and estranged from people who have not been through a war, it is realistic. Other people do not understand. And it is self-protective because people say horrible things to veterans all the time. How many babies did you kill? Why aren't you over it yet? You know, that was 30 years ago. Get over it. What's the matter with you? Why do you keep clinging to the past? That kind of stuff. The phrase, I understand, is really a lie and an insult to veterans. And I guess my clearest realization of this was Bob and I went to Platoon. It was a movie about Vietnam. It's got some pretty hairy scenes in it. And when we came out, I was like, God, did you see that man come staggering out with his arm destroyed and stuff like that? And Bob kind of looked at me a little puzzled and said, it's worse when it's real. And that really hit me because, you know, here I was just all hyper-aroused and upset by a movie. What must it be like when that's happening every day around you in full color, living sound, and reality? The third symptom in this set is a sense of a foreshortened future, which I think is incredibly realistic when you see people being killed that are your age. Who's planning to live long when you're in a war? You know you're going to die. It's self-protective. Why get your hopes up if you think, you know, life can end really soon? You've seen people's lives end just like that. Of course, this is kind of annoying to spouses, you know, like when you have a sense of a foreshortened future, you may not plan for the future, you may decide, why pay the rent? I might be dead before, you know, we get evicted, something like that. That can be an aggravation. The fourth one is an inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. This is also self-protective. If you can't remember something, it's probably because it was too overwhelming for you to process it. And so you've got no conscious memory of it, although people often have anniversary reactions to things they don't remember. and they don't know why. That's one of the reasons why it's good to have therapy and find things out. This is a way to avoid pain. The next one is efforts to avoid thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma. If you were happy, if you were bebopping down a jungle trail with your buddies and an ambush opened up, you may try never to feel happy again. If you loved your buddies, you may try never to feel love again. If you feel guilty about what happened to your buddies, you may spend the rest of your life having to be right so that you never have to feel guilty again. Probably the main form of avoiding thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma is substance abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, and also behavioral compulsive behavior like gambling, sex, or workaholism. Now, you know, a lot of World War II vets, they thought they did not have post-traumatic stress disorder, but many of them are coming in with it nowadays when they've stopped working, you know, and they were very successful, and they did a lot of working, and some of them had 3 or 4 wives, and some of them had other problems. But when those compulsions stop working for you, and you know, the compulsion, I am really, really grateful that those behaviors are available to people, because most people, when they get PTSD, they don't know what it is, and they think they're nuts. And if they go down to the VA hospital and ask for help, they get told, you're nuts. Especially back between 1968 and 1980, there was no diagnosis of PTSD, and you could not get help. So if you turned to booze, you were doing something creative. But of course, booze can become your biggest problem also. What these are, what avoiding thoughts and efforts to avoid thoughts and feelings associated with the trauma are a very self-protective thing. You want to avoid triggers, things that make you feel worse, things that give you flashbacks, things that put you in rages and stuff like that. One of the problems with it is, though, when you refuse to have your emotions, you know, like shame or guilt or despair or fear or grief, sadness, you get depressed. In my opinion, that's the cause of depression. It's trying to stifle your emotions. And the second thing is, when you're stifling your emotions, usually that you have outbursts at some point, and often they're quite angry. The next one is a loss of interest in significant activities, and people will stop doing things they used to love to do because they want to avoid triggers. They're not going to go hunting because shooting things is a trigger. They're not going to go to crowds because crowds are a trigger, because they saw somebody hurt or blown up or killed in the middle of a crowd. Crowds attract fire. So they don't do the things that they once did. The last one is efforts to avoid activities or situations, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. This is also an attempt to avoid triggers. Sometimes it's lifers. They don't want to go anywhere where there are people who acted like lifers did in the Army. For instance, they can't go to the post office because those people are mean. And, you know, sometimes they're very rigid. They can't have firecrackers around them. They don't like the 4th of July because the 4th of July, it sounds like combat. Or they can't go to parties where there are people who don't care about what they did in a war and talk about how, you know, World War II veterans, it was like, oh yeah, while you were over there larking around Europe, we couldn't get cigarettes over here. Vietnam veterans, it's, you know, yeah, so it wasn't even a war, that kind of thing. The next set of symptoms are numbing symptoms. That was totally wrong. I've just been talking about the numbing symptom. I'm going to start over again. Numbing symptoms have the problem for people that they lead to isolation to avoid triggers, and they also promote denial, you know. Number 1, it didn't happen. Number 2, it didn't affect me. It is a lot of work not being affected by things that would affect anybody. And like I said, when you refuse your emotions, you get depressed and you have outbursts. Now, of the numbing symptoms, you need 3 of those to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The second set of symptoms, the arousal symptoms, at the moment of trauma, your brain is flooded with neurohormones hormones that totally gear you to act. There's the fight, the flight, or the freeze thing. They're biologically based. We all have it, and we use it or we die. That is the bottom line. If you don't use these things, you will be dead if you're in a war or some other kinds of trauma. So you have to do whatever it takes to survive, and some of it is not pretty. And that is why guys don't like to talk about it. They have seen a lot of unpretty things. They've seen a lot of horrible things. Now, the first symptom in this set is called exaggerated startle response. And you know, no matter how much you care about people with PTSD, no matter how much you want to help them, this phrase, written by psychiatrists who really care, proves that you cannot understand what it is like to be traumatized if you haven't been. Because it's not an exaggerated startle response. It's an effective startle response. You lived, you moved fast enough not to be killed. It's embarrassing, though. This exaggerated startle response later on, when the backfire comes and you hit the floor without thinking about it and everybody's laughing, or your wife walks up behind you and pats you on the shoulder and you go wham and smash her one, that's pretty embarrassing. It's something that helps you stay alive, and yet it can become a problem later on. The second one is called hypervigilance. People who grew up in alcoholic families can read minds. They are always watching to see if the alcoholic's angry, or is it safe to be there, or should they get out the window and run. Combat vets can read each other's minds. They know what their friends are going to do and what they're thinking when they have been together for a while. And they can also sense the enemy. That's hypervigilance. They can read trails. They know who in this room has a gun, if anybody does. They know where the exits are. They know how to get out of here. They know what mood people are in. They know where it's safe and where it isn't safe. This is how you stay alive. Now, unfortunately, one of the things hypervigilance does is cause a lot of adrenaline in your body. And people with chronic PTSD, in a normal person, they get an adrenaline rush, and their brain then secretes cortisol, which brings you back to even keel. People with chronic PTSD, they expected them to have a whole lot of cortisol. But when they did studies, they found out they had depleted cortisol. They do not have enough cortisol to calm down after they have been hyperaroused. So if they get really angry, they can't calm down. If they get really scared or tensed up or something like that, they cannot calm down. They simply do not have enough of the chemical that it takes. The next one is inability to fall or stay asleep. You know, in war, the worst nightmare of every soldier is to fall asleep and be killed. In Vietnam, the night belonged to Charlie. But wherever you were in a war, you did not want to be sleeping when the enemy was out there and might be creeping up to cut your throat or something like that. So the inability to fall asleep or stay asleep is a very good survival skill. It keeps you alive. The other thing it does for you is it makes you really grumpy. People who do not get enough sleep are grumpy all the time. And it's the most effective form of torture. You know, the people who were tortured by the Gestapo and by the Soviets said that Gestapo were amateurs. All they wanted to do was cause pain. The Soviets just didn't let you sleep until you told them everything. It is a very hard thing to deal with. The next one is irritability or outbursts of anger. These things result from an innate sense of justice, which we all have. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve for people to be trying to kill me. And this is something that can save your life in war. If you can go from being fine to being in a killing rage in nanoseconds, it will save your life, because that's sometimes how fast you have to react. The response that veterans develop to what is going on around them happens in nanoseconds. Now, for a thought to get up to your forebrain and back down to action takes longer than that. It takes tenths of seconds or something like that instead of millionths of seconds. So this is not the kind of thing that they talk about where people have angry thoughts and then they're striking out. This is before there's any thought. Strike out to save your life. If you have the kind of anger that builds over time because you think other people aren't acting right, that's a different thing. And there's a lot of help for that kind of anger. But for me, the analogy that I use with this is, if my husband has PTSD and he can go into a nanosecond anger thing and then he won't have enough cortisol to calm down, I need to walk away from fights. Now, I didn't used to want to do that. I used to like to be right all the time. So I could never walk away from a fight. But for me, it's like, if he was on oxygen, would I be lighting matches around him? Probably not. So I'm not going to light any matches around him now, most of the time. I can't say that this is always true. As a matter of fact, we occasionally have some rip-roaring fights because I have to be right. But usually I notice it after a while and I go and make amends to him for having to be right. The last one is inability to concentrate. And you know, there should be parentheses there on the everyday. Because believe me, war veterans are concentrating on survival. They know who's in the room, they know where the exits are, they are looking at all that kind of stuff. They know what they need to help them survive. And one of my favorite analogies about this is, suppose your veteran's going down to the store and you need diapers and milk for the baby. And he needs cigarettes and beer, which help him survive. And you say, get the diapers and milk too, will you, honey? And he goes down to the store and he comes back and he doesn't have the diapers and milk. Guess what? You're pissed, really pissed. But to him, that was just because it wasn't survival. Survival was the beer and the cigarettes, which are going to help him stay numb. So that causes a lot of problems. But okay, the next set of symptoms, no, I did it again. I've been talking about hyperarousal symptoms. They cause big problems for veterans. They're afraid of hurting people, so they isolate. Another problem it can cause is the only time they feel alive because they're so numbed can be when they're in a rage or in danger. And this can kind of become an adrenaline addiction. And they can also go through cycles where they're numb and they have an outburst and they're getting numb again, so they won't have an outburst, and then they have another outburst, and it cycles over and over and over again. Also, when they do things that create chaos in their lives, it may be the only time that they feel alive. So some of them will, just get themselves into trouble so they can feel alive. The third set of symptoms is re-experiencing. And there's several explanations for this. Some people think it's the brain's better safe than sorry system warning you, don't forget, this could happen, don't forget, it could happen. Other people believe that when you have an experience that has not been coded in verbal memory, it stays active in your brain, and that's why you keep having flashbacks and nightmares about it. And if you don't think there's a thing like a nonverbal memory, just, pick up your leash and go toward the door and watch your dog have a nonverbal memory of what's going to happen. Anyhow, I think the third thing that it is it's a message from your inner self. I think it's a message from your inner self. I just hit the microphone, so. I think it's a message from your inner self saying that this did bother you. What you lived through did bother you, and you need to find some help and support. People are not meant to live in isolation. They're not meant to ignore what happened to them. They are meant to get together and talk about things and help each other. Now, the re-experiencing symptoms, one of them is reoccurring, distressing, intrusive recollections of the trauma. People do not want to be remembering this stuff. They don't want to see their best friend blown apart every day. They don't want to think about what Joe looked like when he was medevaced. But they can't stop thinking about it. And sometimes they can't stop talking about it either. But it's the kind of talking about it that they do when they're drunk, and it doesn't help. It doesn't heal anything. Some people dream about it. A lot of veterans have repetitive traumatic dreams of horrible things that happen to them. Over and over again, the same thing happens every night. or over and over again the same thing happens at the same time of year every night, you know, for a month around the time of the trauma. Or they have other kinds of dreams, really weird dreams that make them feel like they're crazy, that have nothing to do with the trauma, but they have very traumatic elements in them. The third form of re-experiencing is acting or feeling as if the thing was happening again. This is otherwise known as a flashback, when for a moment you feel that it's happened. Now, Bob had a flashback one day when I was with him. We were driving into a friend's house to go to a party, and a paintball hit the windshield. And Bob, the car went like this, out of the line of fire, and the guy who hardly ever gets mad at strangers anyhow, gets out of the car and starts walking toward these people saying, if you shoot at me again, I am going to cram that gun up your butt. So, you know, and he said he had a flashback. He thought people were shooting at him, and he just did what helicopter pilots always do. They get out of the line of fire. Boom. He just moved that machine. So I think I know everything about PTSD, you realize. So the next morning I say to him, that must have been really frightening for you. And he looks at me and says, no, it pissed me off. It pissed me off that some jerk like that could do something that puts me right back into the way I felt in Vietnam. That he could evoke that response in me. It really made me angry. And that was really good information for me, because I had never thought of it that way. I just thought they would be really scary. It's great to be open to hearing how it actually is for your veteran instead of how you think it ought to be for him. Now, there's another aspect to flashbacks. It says in the diagnostic criteria, in young children, trauma-specific reenactment may occur. But they never say that that can happen in grown-ups, but I think it does. I think it happens a lot in grown-ups. I think when you see pretty strange behavior that seems to have something to do with danger, warning, or reenacting something that happened to you, that's a trauma-specific reenactment. But of course, they don't want to put that in there because then they'd be responsible. They'd have to pay attention to what people do. The next one is distress at exposure to events that symbolize or resemble the trauma. You know, like when 9/11 happened? Here we are watching people die for nothing, and we can't stop it, and we can't help them. That really hurt a lot of people that had PTSD. And if you didn't know you had PTSD, you might have felt that you were totally crazy. This also includes anniversaries. If Christmas means people getting killed to your veteran, he's not going to be happy about Christmas. Bob doesn't really like it when I talk about it, but he was in a battle called the Iodine Valley about Veterans Day. And I used to think that he didn't love me every Veterans Day. I just thought somebody else was in the bed. There was an Iceman living with me. And I would just go into this terrible, he doesn't love me, it's all over, we're going to get a divorce thing, until I found out about PTSD. And then I realized this is an anniversary reaction. It's not easy for me to realize that at first. At first I would go, he doesn't love me, we're going to get a divorce, and then, oh yeah, maybe it's an anniversary reaction. And then, you know, like a few weeks later, he'd be back, and it was an anniversary reaction. But it took me a while to learn that. The last one of these symptoms is physiological reactivity to reminders of the trauma. The example they use in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a person who was raped in an elevator, gets into an elevator, gets into any elevator, they break out in a sweat and start freaking out. It can also be an adrenaline rush. A lot of Vietnam veterans, when they hear a Huey go over, will get an adrenaline rush. They could start shaking or sweating or having to move or something like that. I even get a rush when I hear a Huey go over, because when Bob came back from Vietnam, he was an instructor pilot, and they were instructing in a new helicopter, and they were anviling into the ground. Boom! Both pilots dead. So every time we heard that Huey take off, there was one Huey at the place where we lived, and it was the ambulance. Every time we heard it take off, we knew somebody was either hurt or dead, and we had to wait till our husband came home to find out if it was him. So I get a real reaction to that too. Re-experiencing is exhausting for veterans, especially if it's nightmares, but even if it's daytime stuff, even if it's just those adrenaline rushes when you hear certain sounds or whatever, it's exhausting. People start to isolate themselves because they feel so nuts, and it just makes you feel like you're crazy. The only helpful aspect of it is I believe that that is the thing that sends the most people for help. You know, when you're having flashbacks and nightmares and stuff like that, you're more likely to ask for help than when you're just numb and mad. Now, the diagnosis of PTSD now says that if these symptoms last for more than a month, you've got PTSD. This is very ironic to people who remember the days when if you came back from Vietnam and your symptoms lasted for more than 6 months, you were screwed up before you went, and you couldn't get any help from the VA. They also say it's supposed to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, meaning that it's hurting you and you're not doing so well. PTSD. I want to tell you a little bit about the history of PTSD. When I repeat myself, it's because I've just screwed up a sentence. I want to tell you a little bit about the history of PTSD. PTSD is mentioned in the Bible. There's a place where King Saul is troubled by an evil spirit of the Lord, which we think is PTSD, and they send for David. And you know what Saul does? He tries to pin David to the wall with a spear. He has rages because David is trying to soothe him with a harp. There's also a psalm in the Bible, which I call the PTSD psalm. It's Psalm 137. Most people think of it as a very sweet psalm. You know, by the waters of Babylon we wept. And I'm not going to go into that because I can't remember it. But it's got three sets of verses. The first one is about how they want you to sing happy songs after you've been traumatized. The Babylonians are saying, sing us a song of Zion. That's what people always want you to do. They want you to forget about what happened to you. The second verse is, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand wither. People who've been traumatized cannot forget. They never forget. And part of the reason they don't forget is because they would be betraying the people who died or other people who have gone through that experience. And the third verse is, happy are they who will be able to slay the children of Babylon and beat their brains out on a rock or something like that. It's a horrifying verse, which they usually don't read in church. People who have PTSD are pissed. They know it was not right for them to be treated that way. And, you know, I mean, that's not a psalm that you would think would have anything to do with PTSD, but I really believe it is the PTSD psalm. There's PTSD in the Iliad and the Odyssey. In Shakespeare, there's a description of it in Henry IV, Part 1. Hotspur's wife is describing him. Her name's Lady Percy. And in very, you know, poetic language, all of the symptoms I've been talking about are described. In the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart or nostalgia. I'll tell you about two Civil War veterans. One was Lewis Payne. He joined the Confederate Army at 16. He was an easygoing, kind, and tender-hearted boy. By the time the war ended, he was obsessed with killing and death. He never left Union wounded alive. He drank out of the skull of a Union soldier. He had explosive outbursts. And in 1865, he tried to assassinate Secretary of War Stewart, or one of the people that they tried to assassinate when they assassinated Lincoln. And he was hung. But in his trial, he said, I am mad from what I've been through. Another guy, Ambrose Bierce, was a Yankee, and Ambrose Bierce was a Union soldier. He joined when he was about 19 with his brother. His brother was killed. He later became a writer. In his writing, he was preoccupied with death, blood, maiming, and destruction. He had nightmares for the rest of his life. He had a failed marriage. He was a heavy drinker. He had insomnia. He had rages, and he carried a gun with him at all times. Now, this is a familiar set of characteristics to people who live with people with PTSD. In 1871, the first scientific paper on post-traumatic stress disorder was by a guy named Da Costa, and he called it soldier's heart, and he talked about how people who had absolutely no physical reason for it would have anxiety states, and their hearts would start beating really fast, and they would practically pass out and stuff like that. In World War I, they called it soldier's heart or shell shock. 2/3 of the wounds in World War I were from artillery, and they thought it was the vibrations of the air from the artillery shells that damaged people. World War I was the kind of war where they thought that 7,000 wastage, 7,000 people killed and wounded a day, they called it wastage, was okay. And the people on the staff never went to the front to see what it was like. By 1915, something like 30,000 shell-shocked men had been sent to England for analytical treatment. By 1922, this is just British statistics. We have no statistics. Our soldiers came back and just were forgotten about. 1922, the British had 50,000 guys with pensions for PTSD, which they called shell shock at the time. And in 29, that had risen to 65,000. That's the post in post-traumatic stress disorder. It hits you later sometimes. And you know, sometimes people think that the worst thing that can happen is to get post-traumatic stress disorder and be ignored. But in World War I, there were other things that were worse. And this is one of them. In World War I, one of the worst things that could happen to you, if they decided that you had not been through enough to have post-traumatic stress disorder. And in that war, you know, people went blind. There was no way to get out of combat unless you were killed, wounded, or you had what's called a conversion reaction, where the people would be just suddenly be blind, or they'd be paralyzed or something like that. They would send those guys to this guy with an electrical machine, and he would attach electrodes to you and shock you until, as he put it in his scientific paper, the dumb speak, the blind see, and the paralyzed walk. And then they would send you back into combat, and they have no idea whether any of those people lived or not. You know, it was just horrible. In 1919, some guy named Freud suggested talking to the soldiers about the trauma, and he called what happened to them war neurosis. Now, in World War II, people who were somewhere near the combat zones started calling it combat fatigue because they knew a little bit about what it was like to be in war. Back home, they were still calling it war neurosis. And when I was writing the book, I read all these articles from the 40s and stuff like that, you know, and it would be, well, this guy went on 23 missions over Germany. He got shot down twice. The second time, he got to watch the rest of his crew burn alive. But the reason he's having problems is that he did not get along with his mom. This is called bullshit. And they also invented the idea of predisposition, which is, well, you were weak before you went, and that's why you have problems. People have problems with war because war is hell. People have problems with war because they care. They don't have problems with war because they're weak. 26% of the casualties in World War II were psychological. 26% of the men on the battlefield broke down and had to be evacuated for psychological reasons. That's a lot. Now, I read an article. How many of you know who Audie Murphy is? Most highly decorated American war veteran of the Second World War. In the 50th anniversary issue of Esquire, there was an article called War Hero, written by a guy who was just a journalist. He knew nothing about PTSD. Audie Murphy had built a bedroom in his garage where he could sleep with the lights on all night long. He slept with a gun under the pillow. He had a recurring nightmare where Germans were attacking, and he kept shooting at him with his rifle, and a piece of it fell off every time he shot until he was just holding the trigger guard. He said, "I used to be able to sleep through a bombardment, and now I can barely survive in my garage." And what he was getting from the VA was simple pills, no help. They did some studies after World War II and during World War II. One of them showed that people were not fighting for mom, apple pie, the United States of America, the flag, or anything else. They fought for each other. They fought for the guy next to them in the foxhole, the guy next to them in the airplane, whatever, the guys on the ground. They fought to save each other. The other study they did was on combat exhaustion, and they found out that if a person was in combat for about 180 days, it was going to be very hard for him to stay in combat, and it was going to affect him for the rest of his life. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association came out with a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And there was a category in there called gross stress reaction. If you had been through a gross enough stress, if you had been through combat, if you had been through a concentration camp, if you had been through some terrible fire or something like that, it would affect you. In 1968, they came out with Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 2, which actually was published during the Tet Offensive. It came out in the beginning of February. In that book, gross stress reaction disappeared. There was a thing called transient situational disturbance. If you had been through something terrible, it could disturb you for about 6 months. But if it was more than 6 months, you were screwed up before it happened. And when you wonder why veterans come into the VA with a chip on their shoulder, a lot of it is because they went into the VA in 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72, all the way up to 1980 looking for help. And they were told they were screwed up before they went to Vietnam and to get out of here. It's very hard to go back and ask for help after something like that happens to you. Now, the one-year tour seemed to fix the 26% casualty rate, psychological casualty rate. They had a 1.2% psychological casualty rate in Vietnam. But in my opinion, that's because there was lots of booze, lots of drugs, including government-supplied drugs, and you knew that you were only going to be there for a year, and almost anybody can hang on for a year. They also knew that if you had been in combat for more than 180 days, it was going to be really bad for you, and yet there were Marines who went over there and were in combat for 395 days, because they went for a year and a month to prove they were tougher than the Army. And since unit solidarity, fighting for the guys next to you, was what really helped people survive psychologically, they started this rotation system where everybody was interchangeable and you didn't know people, and they were these new guys that were dangerous, and then they got to be old guys, but then the really old guys left and there was nobody to help you with how to do this. So for Vietnam veterans, they could not get help when they got back from this war. The best scientific opinion was that they had been screwed up before they went if they were still having problems 6 months later. At the same time, two guys named Archibald and Tuddenham did a 20-year follow-up. Two guys named Archibald and Tuddenham did a 20-year follow-up of World War II veterans in 1965 and found that guys who had never been anywhere near the VA were still having nightmares, startle responses, anxiety, etc. And this was completely ignored. It was published, but it was completely ignored. In 1980, PTSD was forced by a set of concerned psychiatrists who had worked with Holocaust survivors, Vietnam veterans, rape survivors, incest survivors, people who had survived things like nightclub fires and stuff like that. They forced it into the DSM-3 over the objections of the American Psychiatric Association, which thought it would cost the government too much money. Now, trauma causes extra difficulty when it's caused by human intention to do harm, when it's caused by human cruelty, when it's caused by neglect, and when there's betrayal involved. People who have the most problems are the ones who have the most exposure to the trauma, the greatest losses, and the least social support. And one of the horrible things about trauma is that you get very little social support afterwards. For veterans, it's called disreception. You come home from World War II and you're standing in line and some woman says, you know, while you guys were larking around Europe, it was really tough over here. We couldn't get cigarettes and we couldn't get good meat and stuff like that. What do you say to that? What do you say? There's nothing you can say. For Vietnam veterans, it was, you know, how many babies did you kill? Or why did you go? Like it was a choice for most people. One of my World War II veteran friends who hadn't sat at a table for more than a year, his first day home, his stepmother said to him, "Don't you have any table manners?" You know, he's sitting there eating. And of course, you know, after Korea, most people just got straight out indifference. You were where, what, who cares? After Vietnam, there were demonstrators. And people did get spit on when they got home. They got called murderers like Bob did, or baby killers or whatever. Then you get home. And with Vietnam, you know, in World War II, there was a long boat ride home. You had a little chance to adjust on that boat ride. Of course, it meant that you didn't get home in time for the parades that everybody thinks you had. But on that boat ride, you did have some time to adjust. But if you've been in the field where every second word starts with F, and you get home, and you sit down at the dining room table, and you say, "Pass the fucking potatoes," and they go, "Ah!" like that, as if that word were worse than death, worse than bombs, worse than bullets, worse than grenades. That's disreception. There was also the military saying, "I don't know why we're not winning this war, just because we tied their arms behind their backs and won't let them, you know, take land or anything like that." The politicians, "We don't know why they're not winning the war. It's not our fault." There was this thing called spin numbers. Vietnam veterans were given numbers, secret numbers, on their discharge papers that could say something like, he was gay, he was a drug user, he was a pervert, whatever. And they didn't know they were there. And then there was the psychiatric disreception. You know, you come back with flashbacks, they tell you you're a schizophrenic and treat you for that. Well, you know, you can treat somebody with PTSD for schizophrenia, but it's not going to work. It's like treating pneumonia with cancer drugs. And the final disreception, which happens to every veteran, is, "Oh, don't talk about it. It's in the past. Let's get over it, okay? Let's just live today." The other thing about PTSD that most people don't know is that it's an epidemic. There are some studies of World War II veterans who were in the hospital for medical reasons, had nothing to do with PTSD, and they just studied them to see if they had PTSD. And some of them were POWs and some of them were combat veterans. And they found out that about half, or up to 60%, of them had had post-traumatic stress disorder at some time in their life. 3 numbing, 2 hyperarousal, 1 re-experiencing symptom lasting for more than a month. And nobody had even noticed it. They were in the VA for something else completely. Now the VA is trying to talk to every combat veteran, every POW, and see if they do have PTSD. The earlier studies on post-traumatic stress disorder would be something like the guy interviews 800 veterans of the Vietnam era, doesn't even ask them if they were in Vietnam, and then says, well, only 10% have PTSD. Doesn't ask them if they were in Vietnam, doesn't ask them if they were in combat. Now, in the 80s, they did a better study where people who cared actually interviewed the veterans. They used several, instruments, like a series of questions that are designed to detect whether you have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that study cost $9 million, and it came out right after Reagan was elected president, and he suppressed it, basically. They printed 32 copies, I think. If you divide that up, they cost quite a lot. Maybe 320 copies, I don't know. But luckily it was a government printing office thing, so anybody could print it. And Bruner Maisel brought out a book called Trauma and the Vietnam War Generation. But the most significant statistic in that book to me is that of people who had high war zone stress, and high war zone stress means you had a lot of traumatic stressors. If you were a nurse, you saw a person who had been injured after person who'd been injured over and over and over again. Body baggers. If you were in combat, you got shot at over and over again. You saw wounded people over and over again. You wounded people over and over again. Lots of traumatic stressors. If you were flying into a hail of bullets in a slick, the same kind of thing. Of people who had high war zone stress, 33% of them had post-traumatic stress disorder, diagnosable, 3 numbing, 2 hyperarousal, 1 re-experiencing at that time. They could have been diagnosed if they could have found anybody to diagnose them. 33% of them had had it at one time or another. That's 66% of people with high war zone stress who had had PTSD by then. And the 34% left over, old line psychiatrists would say, well, why are they so resilient? I say they don't have it yet. They may never get it. They may be lucky. They may never get it. But you can never say that somebody didn't get PTSD until after they're dead. So I think it's really important to realize how common it is. Now, of an FBI study of surviving spouses of police officers showed that 59% of these people whose husbands were in dangerous jobs and who, should be expect them to be killed, but 59% of them have PTSD when it happens. It's a normal reaction to trauma. Normal, normal, normal. The other thing that really bugs me is that diagnosable PTSD is this 3 numbing, 2 hyper alert, 1 re-experiencing. So if you've got 75 numbing symptoms and 33 re-experiencing symptoms, but you're not hyper alert today, does that mean that you don't have PTSD? I don't think so. So there's always a question for me about the diagnosis. And for most people, I think it's much wiser to look at your own experience and see what is causing you trouble if you want to get help.